What if the biggest disaster in Harry and Meghan's post-royal empire wasn't hidden behind palace walls, secret meetings, or royal family feuds, but sitting inside a warehouse filled with unsold jam? Because according to a shocking chain of events that exploded after a website glitch exposed information nobody was supposed to see, a story began unfolding that looked far bigger than a failed product launch. It looked like the unraveling of an entire brand. And the most explosive part? The clues were reportedly sitting in plain sight all along.
Today, the implosion of the Sussexes. Meghan Markle's Archewell charity scam and as ever lies have finally been exposed, an astonishing double blow.
I'm firstly grateful to them because they pushed the book up to #1 on Amazon. And secondly, I'm not surprised. I mean, for them, any criticism is always poisonous and damaging, and particularly from me. But I can assure you it's very well sourced. And it's true. I mean, that's the point. It is actually, unfortunately, true at the time.
We didn't plan for everything selling out in under an hour. And so watching those metrics happen in real time, it's already sold out. Because I'm business-minded, I'm immediately going, okay, well...
How good. How embarrassing.
For years, Harry and Meghan sold a vision that leaving the monarchy would unlock unlimited success, massive deals, Hollywood influence, billion-dollar opportunities. They walked away from royal life carrying global attention, endless media coverage, and what many believed was one of the most valuable personal brands on earth. But then strange things started happening. One project launched, then stalled. Another deal arrived, then quietly disappeared. A glamorous announcement would dominate headlines one month only to be forgotten the next. At first, critics called it bad luck. Supporters blamed hostile media. But as the years passed, the pattern became harder to ignore. And then came the image that nobody could stop talking about. Employees reportedly leaving offices carrying celebrity-branded products that allegedly weren't selling. Not because demand was overwhelming. Not because shelves were empty. But because there was simply too much inventory sitting around. Too much product. Too much hype. Too many expectations colliding with reality. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't about royal status anymore. It was about numbers.
I love that quote. A quote from a Netflix insider. Their offices were covered in as ever products. And this Netflix insider goes, there was just so much jam everywhere, jam, that they couldn't sell. It's pathetic, it really.
That image alone sparked uncomfortable questions. If everything was thriving behind the scenes, why were these stories emerging? Why did every new venture seem to arrive with enormous publicity, but eventually become surrounded by rumors of disappointment? And perhaps most importantly, who saw this coming before anyone else? The answer may lie in revelations surrounding Tom Bower's book. Because unlike ordinary celebrity gossip books packed with anonymous whispers and vague allegations, this story entered dangerous territory. Financial records, public filings, corporate documents, numbers, actual numbers, the kind that don't care about public relations campaigns, the kind that sit quietly in databases waiting for somebody to connect the dots.
Sussexes only will talk to people who repeat their own narrative.
Yes.
And who they can control. So the idea that you could get the truth from the Sussexes is...
According to reports discussed in the book, what appeared on the surface as isolated setbacks may actually have been pieces of a much larger puzzle. A puzzle stretching across multiple ventures, multiple years, and millions upon millions of dollars. And the deeper investigators allegedly looked, the more the same questions kept appearing. Why did projects launch with enormous fanfare only to lose momentum later? Why did critics keep pointing toward a recurring cycle of excitement followed by disappointment? And why were insiders increasingly describing the situation as something more serious than simple business challenges? What makes this even more fascinating is that some reports suggest warnings existed long before any of these ventures were launched, before the streaming deals, before the podcasts, before the lifestyle brands, before the jam. According to accounts now resurfacing, concerns were allegedly expressed years earlier by individuals who believed trouble was coming long before the public ever noticed. At the time, few people paid attention. After all, who would question a couple backed by global fame, royal connections, and multi-million-dollar opportunities? But years later, with failed projects piling up and uncomfortable financial questions emerging, those early warnings suddenly looked very different. And then investigators started examining the money itself. Because once the conversation moved away from headlines and into financial documents, the story became much harder to explain away. And what those documents allegedly revealed would trigger an entirely new wave of controversy surrounding Archewell, donor questions, mounting deficits, watchdog concerns, and a financial picture that critics argue raises even more questions than answers. What investigators allegedly found next is where the story stopped looking like a collection of unfortunate business setbacks and started looking like a pattern. Because when attention shifted toward Archewell's financial filings, critics claimed the numbers painted a deeply uncomfortable picture. Reports pointed toward revenue that appeared dramatically smaller than the public image surrounding the organization. Even more troubling, questions reportedly emerged about how dependent the operation had become on a single major donor. And whenever a charity appears heavily reliant on one source of funding, people naturally begin asking the same question: what happens if that support suddenly disappears? That question lingered over everything. Critics weren't just talking about money anymore, they were talking about sustainability, they were talking about transparency, they were talking about whether the carefully constructed image of unstoppable influence matched what was allegedly happening behind the scenes. And the more observers examined the details, the more unusual everything seemed. Reports of watchdog concerns, questions surrounding audits, regulatory issues that generated uncomfortable headlines. None of these stories individually would have been catastrophic, but together they created something far more dangerous, a narrative. And narratives are powerful because they don't need to be entirely true to become influential. Once people start seeing a pattern, every new setback gets added to the pile. Every failed launch becomes evidence. Every disappointing project becomes another piece of the puzzle. Suddenly, Spotify wasn't just Spotify. Netflix wasn't just Netflix. Archewell wasn't just Archewell. Critics began connecting everything together into one giant storyline about promises that generated headlines but struggled to produce lasting results. Then came Netflix, the deal that was supposed to prove everything. The deal that symbolized independence, influence, and financial power. For years, it stood as proof that Harry and Meghan could build an empire outside the palace gates. But as time passed, questions reportedly started growing louder. Where were the projects? Where was the content pipeline? Why did so many announcements seem to vanish into silence? The answer depended on who was telling the story. Supporters argued the couple faced impossible scrutiny. Critics argued the output simply didn't justify the hype. Either way, one fact became impossible to ignore. The relationship reportedly changed. What began as a historic partnership allegedly evolved into something far less glamorous. Reports surfaced about downgrades, changing arrangements, and growing frustration. Then came stories suggesting that even top executives had cooled dramatically toward the relationship. And suddenly the jam disaster wasn't just about jam anymore. It became a symbol of a much bigger question hanging over the entire Sussex brand. Was the brand itself losing value? That's where the story becomes especially painful, because according to accounts discussed in Bauer's reporting, even Harry's most personal charitable efforts allegedly felt the impact. Centerby, the organization connected to some of the most meaningful work of his life, reportedly became caught in the same storm. Claims emerged that donors were becoming hesitant. Sponsors were reconsidering involvement. Internal tensions reportedly escalated. And perhaps most devastating of all were allegations that people directly involved began expressing concerns about how the Sussex image itself was affecting support. Imagine hearing that. Imagine being told the very brand you believed would strengthen your mission might actually be weakening it. For many observers, that was the moment everything changed. Because jam can fail, podcasts can fail, television projects can fail. But when concerns allegedly start touching causes connected to legacy and purpose, the conversation becomes much more serious. And that brings us back to the palace warning mentioned at the beginning. The warning that reportedly existed before the wedding. The warning that allegedly predicted turmoil long before any streaming deal was signed. Looking back, supporters may call it coincidence. Critics may call it foresight. But either way, the comparison is impossible to ignore. One failed project can be explained. Two can be blamed on bad luck. Three can be defended as unfortunate timing. But when the same cycle appears again and again and again, people inevitably begin asking whether the problem isn't the projects themselves, but the assumption behind them. Because the most explosive question raised by this entire saga isn't whether Harry and Meghan can survive financially. They probably can. The real question is whether the Sussex brand still carries the power it once did. And if the answer is changing, then that warehouse full of unsold jam may not be the ending of the story at all. It may only be the first visible crack in something much larger that is still quietly unfolding behind the scenes.